All right, we're recording.
Okay, so round 2 of March meetings for the BAC as we work our way through the budget. Tonight, no idea why Williamsburg attendance is calling me.
I just got an attendance call myself.
It's 7 o'clock at night.
Don't you love when you get those?
Me too.
Interesting. All right, maybe they're canceling school tomorrow. All right, with that, so tonight we have Bridget Loft, who's our Chief Academic Officer, really talked to us about some of the questions we had about learning loss and some of the special education questions, which, important to a lot of folks in the community about the learning loss and, what are we doing? What does this budget do to help begin to arrest some of the challenges we saw with that? And then, the latter half, we'll talk about our strategy going into the budget work session that the BAC will have with the school board and how we're going to begin to frame our advice and our recommendations as we move forward. So with that, we'll go ahead and open it up to public comment first. If you are a member of the public, please go ahead and raise your hand and then we'll go ahead and recognize you.
Hi, this is Miranda Turner. I was hoping to make public comment, if that's
Sure,
okay.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I understand it's 5 minutes, so I'm gonna set an egg timer for myself and might have to speed read for a minute. So I just wanted to take the opportunity to emphasize what I think should be a major APS budget priority on learning loss, which is extensive, I think, and something that really should be prioritized in this year's budget. I just wanted to flag a couple of data points. I know Dr. Duran is planning to do this at the March 24th meeting, but in advance, there are already math inventory scores out that are showing a dramatic increase in the percentage of students who are scoring below basic at this point in the year in middle school, which is the data that I have access to. Specifically, almost 40% of students in middle school began the school year at below basic. For comparison purposes, at the beginning of last school year, 2020 to 2021, it was only 26% in the below basic category. And then the pre-pandemic year, 2019 to 2020, it was only about 25% in the below basic category. The winter math inventory shows that students are still behind where they normally would be, with 26% still in below basic. Pre-pandemic, by the winter of the pre-pandemic school year 2019 to 2020, it was only 15.5% in the below basic, which is really consistent, I think, with what more knowledgeable people than I would say is a pattern of students improving over the course of the school year, which is what we want to see. And we are seeing that this year in the data, which is all I'm speaking to, but there's a much larger than usual number of kids who are behind. I also want to note that there are serious flags for what this means for the achievement gap. Pre-pandemic, it was the case that a higher percentage of Black and Hispanic students were in the below basic category than white students. And APS generally improved over the course of the school year on that. And the data indicates that the gap would close somewhat. This year, so far, the data looks different. It looks as though the gap may be widening over the course of the school year. Specifically, the gap between Black and Hispanic students versus white students appears, based on some numbers I've run, to be 50 to 75% larger at this time in the school year than it was at this time in the school year pre-pandemic, which would suggest that APS may be catching the white students up at a faster pace than the Black and Hispanic students, which, if true, would be the reverse of prior years and a concerning trend. I want to touch on reading briefly. There's Dibbles data that shows a large percentage of students are categorized at risk. This has been presented to the ELAC committee, and they require intensive support, including 27.8% of kindergartners and about a quarter of first graders. We have about 4,000 kindergarten and first grade students. So for context, that's going to be about 1,000 kids just in those grades in need of intensive support during these really critical learning to read years. I don't have any comparison data on Dibbles because APS began using it recently, but I think it's worth noting that over the course of the last school year, 2020 to 2021, the percentage of elementary school students in the requiring intensive support category increased over the period of time that APS was all virtual. Both of these areas of deficit are more pronounced in schools where a higher percentage of students receive free meals. So those schools are going to have a bigger lift to help kids catch up because they will have more kids to help. Both of these areas of deficit are likewise more pronounced for students with disabilities. I think the proposed budget has a big increase in special education funding, which is absolutely needed. But again, from the perspective of learning loss strictly, it may be important to ask if the right special education services are being prioritized, understanding that a lot of the expansion is overdue and badly needed in light of the fact that students with disabilities are owed so many hours, recovery and compensatory hours. Recently, APS was awarded about $2 million from the state in additional funds to address learning loss. It applied for $15 million, so there's a shortfall there in what we asked for. APS intends to use it for interventionists, literacy coaches, purchasing of curriculum resources, and professional development. APS also has some federal funding that it says it's going to dedicate about $148,000 to tutoring. I would say that this is not enough given the number of kids who need to be caught up. We have a large closeout surplus this past year, and I would argue that more of it should be devoted to learning loss because the surplus was really extra funds due to the savings generated by having schools closed for a period of time, and the students who were harmed by those school closures really ought to be the ones who benefit from it. I realize I'm running out of time. I have other points, but I've already gone on for a while. I just want to emphasize that Ms. Loft said at the February 17th board meeting about the state funding, we were encouraged to ask for what we needed in the grant application. So we asked for 15 million and we got about 2 million. So that's really impacting the scope of our ability to hire, which is absolutely true. So if there is another place in the budget, for example, through closeout funds that don't need to be dedicated to reserves, that funding could come from, I think the learning loss is urgent and should be prioritized. And I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Sorry, thank you. Josh?
Hi, so I'm going to take the words off one of the previous chairs of BAC, which always had the SITS acronym. So if you didn't have something intelligent to say, to not say a whole lot, other than to say, you know, I'm here for the discussion. I'm going to exit out for a little while and come back on at 8 o'clock when it says we're going to chairs and then discussion of the budget stuff. And so I welcome discussion, and if there's any questions that I can answer from the from an educator's perspective, be happy to join in on that. One thing I am just excited from the educator's perspective is I went and did the tour of math books today over at Kenmore Middle School. Math has not had an adoption since 2011, and it was quite exciting to just see the possibilities of not having to literally invent something every single day. So I am glad that the money was in the budget for that, and I hope that maybe that this committee is committed to ensuring that that money is always there on a regular basis to update the materials used by our educators. So my wife is a first grade teacher, was also excited to peruse the materials as well. All right, so I'll be back at 8.
Thank you. Any other members of the public? Okay, appreciate your comments, and with that, we'll go ahead and move. We're going to skip the May 9 minutes. We'll do that in our next session. So with that, what I'd like to do is to transition our time to our Chief Academic Officer, Bridget Loft, who's joining us tonight. So first, Bridget, thank you for taking the time on a Wednesday night to talk to us. But really, you know, I think what we're all voicing and echoing is what has happened to our students the last couple of years, and it's some unprecedented time. So welcome your viewpoint, given your responsibilities, and how this budget is going to address some of the issues that came out in the budget direction, but also from your perch as our Chief Academic Officer, some of the things that would be important for us to know and consider from your viewpoint about this budget and how we look ahead to it. And so with that, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Sure. Sorry. I was explaining to Leslie I'm having some Teams issues, so sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yep, perfect.
Yeah, okay, great. Sorry, so thank you very much for the opportunity to join you. Leslie had forwarded a few questions as it related to learning loss. And so if you're okay with that, I'll kind of frame my sort of opening thoughts around some of the questions that were forwarded, and then be happy to engage in dialogue as well. So I'd like to start by absolutely acknowledging that our students are experiencing significant learning gaps, and that we have had to adjust our instruction to scaffold and provide additional supports for learning. I appreciate Ms. Turner bringing up in her public comment the application that APS made to use some of the ESSER 3 unfinished learning funds that were being allocated by VDOE. We did apply for about 15 million in support, and we received about 2 million. 2 million to address unfinished learning between this school year and 2024 school year, and then 147,000 to address some after school tutoring that can happen this starting now. So I'll talk a little bit about how we plan to use those funds, and then speak more broadly to this year's budget and how some of the resources that are being allocated to the Office of Academics are going to addressing some of that unfinished learning. So for the 2 million that we were allocated, and again, yeah, we asked for 15.5 million. We are going to be able to hire 6 math interventionists, and I want to take a moment to differentiate between math coaches and math interventionists. So currently, each of our elementary schools are allocated a 0.5 math coach. With the that's our sort of current baseline funding for our elementary schools, and then each of our middle schools are allocated a 1.0 math coach. Our high schools are not allocated math coaches. This year, we were able to allocate additional staffing to elementary schools that had enrollments of 650 or over, so our larger elementary schools and our Title I elementary schools, so that they could have in total a 1.0 math coach. All of our elementary principals recognize and appreciate the value of the math coach, and so they do, if they have just a 0.5, they do repurpose some staffing so that they can have at least a 1.0. And most of our Title I school principals will leverage Title I monies to be able to have additional math coaches. And so let me differentiate between a math coach and an interventionist. Math coaches really work directly with teachers. So they meet with the collaborative learning teams to focus on lesson planning, lesson pacing, looking at student performance data from some, for example, from our math screeners to determine which students need more intensive intervention, which students might need extensions. They also work with those collaborative learning teams to develop those interventions and those extensions. So they are really working kind of on that continuous cycle of improvement. Math interventionists actually deploy those interventions. So they're working much more directly with students. Currently, none of our schools are allocated from operating funds math interventionists. So it is possible that our math coaches are acting as interventionists as well, which then takes away their ability in a single school day to work more closely with teachers, to hone skills, to work on student data, to inform instruction. And so we do really feel that we need to deploy those additional grant funds that we received to specifically hire math interventionists. Since we received 2 million, we're looking at deploying 6 of those interventionists. So, if you ask me kind of what my wish list is, I really wish that we had funding to be able to ensure in sort of in perpetuity that each of our elementary schools would have a 1.0 minimum math coach, and that we could also hire interventionists, because then we can be assured that we are able to deploy the targeted interventions based on student performance level in a way that's strategic and nimble, because really research-based interventions are, if we're deploying them in the way that has been proven to be efficacious, we should be reshuffling students in small group interventions every 2 weeks. Because we don't have the personnel to do that. Often intervention cycles last between 6 to 9 weeks. So we need that to address Ms. Turner's public comment, as our gaps can be widening, and that we have significant learning gaps coming out of the pandemic. We need to be more nimble in deploying those interventions. So that's one piece that we are projecting to use those monies. And so we would be hiring this 6 math interventionists for next school year and the following. So for 22-23 and 23-24, who can directly support students and implement the evidence-based intervention program. We're also looking to hire literacy coaches. So each of our schools currently are allocated a 1.0 reading specialist. And this past in FY22, we were able to allocate an additional 0.5 reading specialist, again, for those large elementary schools, so 650 and over, and for our Title I elementary schools. So some of our schools have a 1.5 reading specialist. Most have a 1.0. And so, again, the reading specialists act much like a math coach would. So they're working with the collaborative learning teams, identifying pacing, helping to roll out and support particularly our K2 teachers in our shift to structured literacy that's in support of the science of reading and or in alignment with science of reading. Definitely working with our 3-5 teachers, for example, to hone not just the reading instruction, but also the writing instruction. And also looking at student performance data to determine kids who need interventions and extensions. And then again, we're limited in our staffing and our ability to work directly with students in the way that we'd like to see that. And that's where we are looking to hire our literacy coaches so that the reading specialists can act as interventionists. Through the grant, we're going to be able to hire 2 literacy coaches. And we expect to be deploying both those math interventionists and literacy coaches to schools whose screener data through Dibbles and Math Inventory are indicating that they need some more significant support as it relates to student performance and interventions. We're also looking to purchase some evidence-based instructional resources, so ensuring that we have Lexia Core 5 for all of our elementary schools for next year, using some of that money, and then providing the professional learning for staff during this upcoming summer and then the following summer to train them in math recovery intervention training for the 6 interventionists and for some of our trainers, and then also focusing on writing through Writing Revolution, which is an evidence-based program that will support interventions in writing. So that gives you some sense of how we're looking to deploy the grant monies. I will say, and then let me talk a little bit about what are we doing this year as far as tutoring through the grant monies. Again, we received about $140,000 to deploy tutoring to, and we're targeting students in math and literacy by looking at kids who scored in the needing intensive or strategic support on DIBELS, performing at the below basic in the math inventory, or who failed their spring 2021 math or reading SOL. When we sort of shift towards the budget, we are deploying, currently we have funds to help us address areas such as social studies and in science. And at the secondary level, we are using a program called Courseware, which is the parent company is Edmentum. We have an existing contract with them. And Courseware allows us to, at the secondary level, identify the power standards that have been introduced in specific social studies and science courses. Certainly can expand that to English and math courses as well. And then allows us to do some diagnostic assessments so that we can really identify in particular units, where do kids need additional support. So if a child scores at 75% or above in that unit, then we don't need to use that time to focus on that unit. We can move to another area in which they may need more intensive support. So we are leveraging some of that software to help inform interventions at the secondary level, particularly in the core content areas. I can speak to also, there's another program through Edmentum called Exact Path that focuses on reading, math, and writing. It too has a series of diagnostic assessments that then, once the students participate in that, develops a personalized learning plan for students that really targets those specific power standards or skills that they need to, need reinforcement as well as an enrichment. We have deployed that for all of our virtual learning program students, and we expect to be using it for our in-person students as foundation in summer school, which is serving as a tier 3 intervention for students who are scoring in the below basic range in math and in reading. And then projecting to be able to use it also next school year with more scope. So that kind of gives you an overview of some of the things that we're working on as far as addressing learning gaps. Ms. Turner mentioned that we do expect to have a public data dashboard available on March 25th. So Dr. Duran will address that on the Thursday, the 24th, during the school board meeting, and then it'll go live on the 25th, and it will then allow members of the public to be able to take a look at students' trends in their performance on our math inventory, reading inventory, and DIBELS. And they can take a look at demographic groups. They can compare a school to APS in general. So it'll allow some more, I think, transparency as far as our student performance as well. So I'm going to keep talking until somebody tells me or points me in a more specific direction. So Chuck, go ahead.
Yeah, so there's a question in the chat from David Rosenblatt explaining, what is magic about the 650 number? Why, that's sort of that dividing line between getting an extra FTE versus not for reading specialists, and frankly for other types of specialists that might fit that planning factor.
So if I understand the question, how did we land on 650 and higher to be eligible to receive the additional staffing? Is that correct?
Yeah, David, is that? Yeah. There's only. Yeah, David, why don't you just hop on? I mean, you're an advisory chair, so feel free.
Yeah, Bridget, I tried to look at that specific budget proposal about the extra reading specialists, and Title I I totally get, but I couldn't understand the 650 because I'm pretty sure there's only 2 elementary schools that are above 650. And so it felt like very weirdly targeted, considering that there are other elementary schools that are at 635, 640, 648. Like, so what's magic about suddenly you go over that level and you need a whole extra human being?
Sure. I'm going to speak from my end, and then maybe Leslie can jump in and speak from the finance end. But I'll say from, we've got finite amount of resources. And so, and I should say this component in the proposed FY23 budget is really continuing the allocation of resources that we were able to do in this fiscal year. So I think we landed on 650 because we had a certain amount of money that we could allocate these resources to our schools of highest need. And as you indicated, our Title I schools are evidencing in their academic performance that they've got a highest need for support. And then when we look at our largest schools, and at this point, we sort of set the cutoff at 650. When you've got more kids, then you need more supports in order to bring those intervention group numbers down to make it more efficacious. So I don't know, Leslie, if you can kind of speak to the decision at 650.
Honestly, I wish I could, but I did not participate in the decision-making process on that one, so I don't know.
Yeah, and I'd have to join Leslie. That was an operational decision that was made. I welcome it, but I can't speak to why 650.
Okay. Let's see, someone else has a hand up. Go ahead.
Hi, Chuck. I have my hand up. I'm not sure. This is Bridget Victoria, if you were referring to me.
Sorry, Bridget, go ahead. I didn't recognize that was you. Go ahead, Bridget.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no problem. So I'd like to align myself with Miranda Turner's comments. Hi, Miranda. How are you? It's good to hear from you. I haven't seen you in a while.
Hey, Bridget. How are you?
Well, thank you. Bridget, thank you for that information. It was very helpful. And what I want to know is, excuse me, I have screaming children in the background. What is it that you would possibly need from us to be able to provide the level of support you need financially for the other schools? Because I, like David, am trying to understand why the 650. I mean, if it's a need that needs to be met, why can't we somehow try to provide it for all of the schools? I mean, I know Title I schools have the greatest need, but certainly some other schools do too. So what could you possibly need to get a 1.0 across all of the elementary schools? And I'll mute my phone for the answer.
I really appreciate your interest and support. And so, I'm going to speak with the caveat that, our current budget, a significant amount of it right now is in service to the compensation package, which I absolutely will acknowledge is something that we need in order to be competitive with our surrounding districts and in order to retain quality staff. So I'm in no way, in the next thing that I'm saying, sort of countering that that the compensation package needs to be addressed in our budget. I do support that. That said, it's a behemoth, right? I feel like I'm preaching to the choir here that folks are aware that it takes up a significant amount of resources, and so. Yeah, as I said, our first priority would be each of our schools needs to have at minimum a 1.0 a math coach. So if we had a full-time math coach, that would allow those coaches to be working with every grade level on basically the 4 pillars, if you will, of collaborative planning. One is identifying those key power standards that we need our kids to know not just in this current grade year, but vertically as well. Then determining what do they know. So really looking at deploying common formative assessments and summative assessments, looking at our screener data, then to really target our students who are not performing outside, or who are not proficient. And then we spend a lot of time focusing on who needs interventions, but I really do want to emphasize too, we've got to be looking at our kids who are demonstrating mastery out of the gate, and what are the extensions that we need to deliver for those students as well. So who's not understanding it and who is understanding it, and what are we doing for those students in a way that is nimble, so that we can address those needs with a level of immediacy, and then make changes quickly. And we can't do that without the instructional leadership of a full-time math coach. So I'd argue for that first. And then I'm gonna be grateful that we have a 1.0 math coach at the middle school. We don't have that at the high school, and we've been struggling with that. So I think we rightly focus a lot of our time and attention on the elementary level to build those foundational skills and conceptual knowledge. And then when our kids hit, algebra in 9th grade, and are struggling, we don't have that same level of support at the high school. So I'd absolutely say we need 1.0 math coaches at the high school as well. And then when we're looking at reading and literacy support, particularly since we have committed to aligning our instruction with the science of reading, which we absolutely, that's an imperative, but we haven't had the resources to be able to fully equip our staff. Josh mentioned, for example, from the math perspective, not having math resources since, 2011, when we made the shift to structured literacy. We didn't have full resources to be able to equip our teachers this year. And so we need to flesh that out. And we need to be looking at, can we deploy literacy coaches so that our current reading specialists can serve as interventionists as well. So in sum, 1.0 math coaches at all of our elementary schools, 1.0 math coaches at our high schools, full resource adoption for math, which we're fortunate that the closeout funds are helping us pursue, full resource adoption for literacy, and then the ability to staff with literacy coaches at all of our elementary schools as well. I think that would be wonderful.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And I see.
Eric, go ahead.
Yeah, so my question was about the $15 million request we put into the state. And it was, how did we come up with that number? What was in that we didn't get, right? Because if we only got 2 million, obviously there were things in there we wanted to do, and are not going to be, don't have the dollars from the state to do it. And then a second part of that is, are there other opportunities to kind of make up some of that or get some of that from other sources, whether it be other grants or the DOE, or do we think there's any line of sight to another path to some of those dollars that you know of?
Right. So really the bulk of that additional $13 million was focused on the staffing piece. So we wanted to be able to leverage far more math interventionists and literacy coaches than we received staffing for. So it wasn't just for our Title I schools, but certainly then our schools who are continuing to evidence significant numbers of students who in their mid-year MI, math inventory and DIBELS assessments at the elementary level of needing, falling into those critical deficit. So the below basic in math inventory and needing intensive support and DEBLS. And then when we look at the middle school, we use RI, our reading inventory instead. And so focusing on that critical area as well. So it was really leveraging far more interventionists as far as that was concerned. As far as additional monies, we're going to continue to keep our ear to the ground as far as if VDOE is going to parcel out any more of federal funds that they've received. I think we, are also working closely with Brian Stockton, the chief of staff, who's got building relationships with Amazon. So certainly don't want to ignore the private sector as well as a source of funds as well. But I don't have anything specific on the horizon.
Do we have other members that have questions? I've got two, Bridget, if no one else is ready to chime in. So the first question kind of relates back to summer school, some of the challenges we had last year with staffing in particular. How do you see summer school rolling out this year as another method by which some of the learning loss might be addressed? Is kind of where you see that going based on where we are now. I know it may be a bit early to have a full assessment, I guess, but where do you see that landing right now?
Yeah, I really appreciate you bringing that up. I will say I'm going to go 30,000 foot view and then bring us to summer of 2023. So we have not, as a system in recent memory, been consistent in our summer school offerings. And because of that, we haven't been able to measure truly whether our summer school model is efficacious. And so I've sort of made it my life's mission for summer of 2023 to really discipline ourselves as far as who are the student population that we'll be serving and how can we measure if it's been impactful. I've also, and I hope Leslie is glad to hear this, made it my life's mission to just try to stay in budget for summer school, because we have traditionally gone over budget for summer school. And so this year, we are focusing on those students who are falling in the equivalent of the below basic range. So they've got critical math and reading deficits. And currently, in looking at those middle of the year results, we have about 2,400 students, and we're counting that as K8, who are falling into that range. And so because it's 2,400 students who are falling into math and reading need, we set that as an eligibility requirement. And that's because if we're also going to hold to a research-based practice of having small class sizes as the way to really implement student accelerated growth, we're looking at class sizes of 10. So quick math, right? 2,400 kids, we're looking at needing to hire 240 teachers in the K8 range, and that's not counting our extended school year services for students, and it's not counting our secondary where we're focusing on credit recovery. So that would be students who had earned an E in any of the core courses that they'd need to graduate. So I'm grateful that we've built in funding for incentives out from the gate. So $1,000 for teachers and $500 for assistants. We've included that in our advertisement as we put that out there. So that we can incentivize staff who are already exhausted and tired. We have surveyed staff as best as we can, our internal staff, And we do have, I think, enough special education staff have indicated interest to provide extended school year. And we just posted for all of our positions this week. I think postings went up on March 14th. So it's a little early to know how we're doing, but we will be monitoring that closely. So I'm concerned because we've got a high volume of need for staffing, and I'm feeling cautiously hopeful that because we've got monies in the budget for incentives, that we'll be able to hire that number of staff. So,
okay, thank you. And my other question relates to it seems like there's a couple of different ways that the budget is improving some abilities to deliver instruction. We obviously interventionists and coaching is one way, but we're also looking at class size reductions as well. Just qualitatively, how do you see is one for as it relates directly to learning loss? Is there one approach or the other that would be preferred, or is it really a cumulative effect of a smaller class size plus more direct intervention? I mean, obviously I think that would be the most preferred, but if we had to make some sort of trade-off, would it be how would you look at that?
Yeah, I mean, I would look at the holy grail of smaller class sizes, well-prepared teachers. And the way we prepare our teachers is through using evidence-based resources with which they've been trained, and deploying the math coach reading specialist, right? To be able to deliver tier 1, which is to everybody, quality tier 1 instruction that spirals to capture some of the skills that students are evidencing deficits in from previous years. So we've got small class sizes, well-prepared teachers, and then the ability to provide interventions that are informed by student performance data, and that we're using those evidence-based resources. So you've got kind of a symbiotic relationship between all three. If I had to choose, out of that holy grail, if you will, I would argue that we really need to have our well-prepared teachers, because evidence research really shows that if you, it's based on that first criteria is if you've got a high quality teacher who is able to be targeted in their instruction, that's going to make the most significant impact on student performance, followed closely by a smaller class size. So I come back to high quality teacher. We need to give them the resources. We need to train them on them. We need to have those math coaches and those reading specialists full on supporting them as job embedded professional learning as well.
Okay, no, thank you. I appreciate that. There's a question in the chat from Jen Wagner. The 15 million, if we'd gotten the full state grant, could you just outline what the staffing, what would have been the level of staffing that would have come with, the full grant had it been given?
I would be happy to follow up and give specifics to Leslie. I'm having a hard time pulling up. We had initially submitted our grants application in November, and I don't have that right in front of me, but I'm happy to give her those numbers so that she can bring it back to the advisory committee.
Okay, no, yeah, that would be great. Thank you. Eric, go ahead. Eric, go ahead.
Sorry. So clearly this situation is not unique to APS, right? I have to imagine that every school district in the United States is facing the exact same thing. They're all going to be looking at the same sort of things, well-prepared, having well-prepared teachers, class size reductions, interventions, but they are also going to be all facing budget limitations. just like we are. I mean, there's certainly there are a lot of things we'd love to do if we had an unlimited budget, as would they. I'm wondering, are there things out there that other school districts may be doing that we might be able to somehow take advantage of that are more creative or outside of the, well prepared, the well prepared teachers, these smaller class sizes, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of our neighboring districts have been able to deploy funds for high impact tutoring that again is targeted and is outsourced. So, for example, some of our surrounding districts are working with some of these online tutors that essentially we deliver the concepts that need to be addressed, and then they connect a tutor with a small group of students or one-to-one. So I think I'm interested to see some of the outcomes. This has been happening since we've returned to full-on in-person learning. So the jury's kind of still out to see if it's moving the needle. I think we'll see it specifically with our end of course SOL tests to see if there's sort of a causal relationship there. I will say that requires funding, and they've been able to deploy some of their federal funds that they received to support that high impact tutoring. So that might be an example of what I'm seeing from some of my colleagues in other districts.
Thank you.
Other questions from the back? Okay, seeing none. Bridget, any kind of final thoughts, comments, opportunity for you to, from your perch, where you would ask the BAC to focus as it relates to your areas of responsibility?
Well, first of all, I want to thank members of the Budget Advisory Committee. I think, we really appreciate your advocacy, and it takes time and attention, and it's not just during budget season. I know that you put in the work year round, and so I want to thank you for your support as we move towards finalizing, I guess, our FY23 budget process. One thing I didn't highlight in this discussion is, a lot of the academics funding requests are focusing on sort of righting the balance in our special education offerings. As Kelly Krug and Heather Rothenbuscher pointed out at last night's budget work session, we have been in a position where we've been robbing Peter to pay Paul in providing related service providers, assistants, and some of student support coordinators. And what I mean by that is that we've had to dip into staffing that is initially allocated for other positions in order to be able to have enough interlude therapists, for example, to meet the hours of service on our students' IEPs, to be able to provide schools with a student support coordinator who really does invaluable work at each school to ensure that IEPs are written accurately to reflect students' needs, to ensure that our special education teachers are well versed in progress monitoring, that liaise with our Office of Special Education to ensure that we're in compliance with state and federal regulations as well. And so I'm very grateful to see that we're starting to right the balance by allocating an appropriate number of positions, so that then, because it's got kind of a ripple effect, if we're, for example, dipping into hearing teacher allocation because we we have a vacancy and we haven't been able to fill that, so we deploy it for a student support coordinator position. Then if we can allocate those positions in the budget, we can then also ensure that we are filling those other positions that we've used on a temporary basis. So I'd say all of our special education items that are in the budget are really integral for us to be able to afford, not even to afford, to be able to deliver the services that our students need. So that would be something I would like you to watch closely and advocate on our behalf for.
Sure. On that note, would you say that you talk about how we've kind of robbed Peter to pay Paul with staffing and whatnot, particularly in the area of special education. Has that staffing been stable over time, or have we seen some turbulence because of the way it's been staffed in the past? I guess, does this budget arrest that trend if that's been the case?
I wouldn't say it's arresting it, and I'll use as an example. So in our current FY23 proposed budget, we are asking for 7 more school support or student support coordinators. We need 11. So we've been able to, we're going to have to continue to be creative in those 4 additional positions that won't be met, because so that we can ensure that each school has the level of support that it would need. So I think it's moving very much in the right direction, but you can expect that we'll be back at the table for the FY24 budget with a request for 4 more student support coordinators. So.
Okay, no, okay. Thanks, and that perspective is helpful. That at least in this case, this specific problem, it's really being phased in over a couple of
exactly
years to be able to get where we want to be objectively.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Bridget, really appreciate you taking the time on a Wednesday night to come talk to us. And obviously, the last 2 to 3 years have been anything but ideal. So appreciate you, your staff, and all the folks who are really doing their level best to try to, under some very difficult circumstances, to keep the kids engaged and teachers doing what they love doing, which is educating our children. So again, appreciate your team's work on that.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here. Thanks very much.
Okay, with that, we'll go ahead. Any of our liaison reps from the BAC to other committees, anybody have comment from those different advisory committees? Yeah, Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say thanks to Bridget as well, especially she's on the ACTL committee, so I get to see her on a regular basis as well. And she covered most of the things we've been talking about there and things I've referenced in both the emails and the highlights I mentioned last week in the budget. So I'm glad we were able to get her in and give her a deeper dive and did a better job than anything that I could have ever done. So I just want to say thanks to her one more time from me especially, but also I think from all of us here on the BAC.
Any other advisory committee liaisons? Okay. All right. With that, turn the floor over to our school board representative, Christina, for any comments you may have for us.
Hi, everybody. Just a couple of brief things today. A strong encouragement to go and watch the work session from last night that talked about some pretty similar topics as to, for what Bridget was talking about earlier, and covered some similar ground, but just in different detail. I think a lot of the sentiments portrayed of wanting to do more, or like some sentiments expressed about wanting to do more, I echo a lot of that. And certainly we would love to be able to do all of the things that we'd like to. Something that is important to remember is that as a school board in the Commonwealth of Virginia, we do not have taxing authority, and we depend on the county board, on the state revenues and on federal revenues to establish what our total allocation is going to be. And then we have to work within that, which does mean that we have to to make some tough choices on a regular basis, and that we have to make some prioritization. And so a lot of good discussion on that, but also just want to emphasize that like there's we can't unfortunately make the pool significantly bigger at the drop of the hat, because that's something that I would love to be able to do, to add all of these extra positions that we are talking about right now. The other thing that we talked about yesterday in the work session were planning factors, and on the research that comes behind the planning factors. Those of you who have been on the BAC for a while remember that we've been talking about these for quite some time. And then Robert comes in every year and does his presentation, but these have been an evolving science. And so Robert gave a really helpful and pretty concise, probably 2 or 3 minute history of where we've been on, not planning factors, I'm sorry, projections. Where we've been on projections, and how our collaboration with the county has improved over the last several years, and how that has changed and helped us get to more accurate numbers over the years. So if anyone is intrigued, strongly encourage you to go back to that section of the meeting. But other than that, nothing else to add. If there's any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Any,
Seeing.
any,
Go ahead, Jack.
Any members with questions?
If anything else comes up, throw it in the chat. I'm happy to respond in the chat as well.
Okay. Well, won't quite let you off the hook yet, Christina. As you guys have, as you guys start to look at this problem and, moving ahead to next month, do you have a sense of where, if we had to make trade-offs, kind of your thought process on different trade-offs we may have to make?
You mean trade-offs in the additions that we have?
Yeah, just in general, not to pin you down specifically, because I know we're a bit early in the process, but I guess, from just kind of where you sit today, and not speaking on behalf of the full board, but kind of where you see some of the trade-offs that we may have to think about as we approach this budget.
It's going to be a very nuanced conversation, especially because our revenue from the state is a big open question right now. We don't know what that final number is going to end up looking like, and there's a lot of variability in what the Senate bill looks like versus what the House bill looks like. I think it's about just under 5 million in variability between those two things. So if we end up on the higher end of that, then the trade-offs that we'd be making would be significantly smaller. If we're on the lower end of that, then we might be making some different choices. I think, as speaking solely as one board member, the additions that we are adding, that we've put in this year, from compensation to the additional staffing to the additional resources, are the bare minimum of what we should be doing in my mind. We've gone through and been very, very tight in adding the things that we believe are essential. And as you heard from Bridget, we would love to do more, but we can't do more at this time. So as one board member, I think for me, the trade-off will be in dipping a little bit further into our reserves. Currently, we're using, I believe it's 3 or so million in reserves that were not just specifically dedicated to the compensation. Can't remember the number off the top of my head, but it would be dipping a little bit more into our reserves to be able to cover that, because these additions are so necessary in this moment. We might, if we were forced to, we might then have to make some additional cuts, but we don't necessarily have a cut list that we're talking about at this point, or that we're considering, because all of the things that we're adding are just really mission critical. Does that answer your question, Chuck?
Yeah, no, it does. It leaves some perspective, at least where your personal thinking is. And
I'm not speaking on behalf of any of my colleagues. That is just myself.
No, totally. Yeah, totally understand. Much like Monique in the past. Yeah. Very, we understand that. Melanie had a question.
Yeah, and actually, Christina, you teed it up well, because my question was going to be about how you're feeling, and I understand you can't speak for the whole group, but how you're feeling in terms of the amount of reserves and one-time funds in this budget, and the fact that although we don't have, unfortunately, a 3-year look forward in the end of this executive summary, we do have a 1-year look forward that this will open up a gap potentially next year that could be sizable if we don't have that kind of one-time funds to put forward again. And of course, there's growth and all sorts of other challenges that could come forward next year. So Curious how you're thinking about that. I know we had some discussion last week about that, and it made some of us nervous, but curious about your thinking and how you're addressing that, given your comments.
Yeah, super agree that it definitely makes me nervous. It is not certainly a conversation that we're taking lightly. And like I mentioned, it's going to be very nuanced. If we have to dip into reserves, it opens us up to more variation in future years. And it puts us in a less strong space in future years. And that's just going to open up a different set of conversations that we would need to have. As one board member, in my mind, the responsible thing to do is to take them in turn and make the best decision given the information that we have at the time. And based on what I'm seeing, these additions that we are looking at are not things that we can continue to wait on. And so pushing forward with them feels very important and valuable to me and for our students. And we would need to have different, if we needed to dip, we would need to have a different set of conversations with our county board colleagues. We would need to have a different set of conversations with our colleagues down in Richmond, our delegation down in Richmond, and we would need to pursue additional federal funding to be able to close this gap, because we are statutorily required to close the gap by the end of, whether it's through reserves or through additional dollars from the county. We have to close the gap at the end of the day. Does that answer the question, Melanie?
It does, but if I can have one follow-up question, and that is, and this goes a little bit maybe into our next topic, Chuck, about how this lines up against the budget direction. One thing in the budget direction was actually asking for other types of efficiencies that we could use to fund these types of, what I agree with, are quite necessary investments. But I don't see a lot of that in this year's budget, or even things where we are investing in studies or other things which are going to lead to those types of efficiencies. So I'd love your commentary on that, because I'm just not seeing us look for those types of trade-offs to fund these very necessary, but also costly and not one-time investments.
Yeah, so we did a lot of the trade-offs that you don't see, it's because they didn't end up in the final budget book, but there were some pretty significant cuts throughout. And actually, if you're going through the budget book, you will see that there are line items that are cut. But the zero-based budgeting exercise that the Office of Academics did, Leslie can speak more to this because she was participating in it and was engaged in it. But there were a lot of things that were left on the cutting room floor, whether they were new additions or they were actual efficiencies. And I do think that the budget study that we are going to engage in next year, additional reviews on compensation, as well as the bell time study, and our overall effort to update our systems are going to return the efficiencies that we've been looking for in the long run. This is a short-term expenditure, in my mind, in order to reap some long-term rewards. So for example, our HR systems are incredibly antiquated, and we lose a lot of human time right now and human capital time on things like processing absence requests. Those are filled out manually, and then someone physically enters that piece of paper into the computer in the central office. And that's because our system has not permitted us to be able to, at the drop of a hat, just like upgrade this and say, okay, now you fill out your leave request on this website, here's the link. The work that we're doing to update those systems is going to give us back so much ROI and just gained efficiency and gain time that we can then choose to either cut if we don't actually need it anymore. Maybe we don't need that position, I don't know. Or do we redirect the position to something else? But it's not, we didn't magically manifest this particular year, but we're starting to see some good signs that we are going to be going in the right track. Does that answer your question, Melanie?
It does, and my apologies to Leslie. I did know there was a 3-year forecast because I have marks all over it. It was the summary and some of the commentary on the gaps that I was missing. So Leslie, I misspoke there. There's absolutely a 3-year budget forecast here, and thank you, Christina.
Eric?
Yeah, so to follow on that, because the financial viability and the budget forecast that's on, I think, page 71 in the proposed budget, starts looking at a FY24 proposed shortfall of 36 million, and then FY25 66 million, and so by digging into our reserves earlier, we just make that hole bigger, right? So the question is, what options may we want to consider to help us offset what looks like not a very viable situation in the future. Has the board discussed, and what's your personal opinion about looking at some of these changes instead of doing them all at once? Maybe rolling them out over a couple of years. So if we talk about planning factors, maybe starting and saying, let's change the planning factors that impact elementary school first, or I don't know which ones you pick first, but we segment them out and roll, potentially $5-10 million of costs associated with some of those things into the next year. And has that been discussed, and what's your personal opinion?
Yeah, so that has been discussed, and there were certainly the things that have ended up as being needed to be added this year are the things that we really that staff have really believed that we needed to add this year. If we are in a last minute crunch, Eric, that's definitely going to be part of the conversation of figuring out if there are any things that we can phase in and what that phase in plan might look like. And it'll be a balance. This is going to be very nuanced if we end up in a situation where we have to have this conversation about cuts. I am hopeful and crossing my fingers that the General Assembly will get its act together and that they will pass a budget soon so that we can have some clarity on that front. We also know that we will be getting some enrollment updates and some forecast updates throughout that may change what our final numbers end up looking like. So we will have to consider all of the things, but at this moment we are taking the information as we have it in front of us. Does that answer your question?
No, it makes sense. I get it.
Yeah,
it's kind of
there's not there isn't a magical spreadsheet of if we have to do these, then we will make these cuts in this way. We would have, when we get to that moment, we will have to have the conversation, and it'll end up coming as part of a work session, as part of a board discussion, etc.
I get it. And this is kind of an iterative thing, and we kind of, as we get more information, we can make, we have to look at a different set of decisions.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm just trying to think about some of those things ahead of time so we can, bring those to the board in a couple weeks.
No, super appreciate it. It's just, this is tough. It's a tough, we are not in as tough of budget years as we've seen in the past, in the sense that it is not as painful, but it is still nuanced, and we are still dealing with a lot of uncertainty just because of our current economic state.
Yeah, I mean, to that point, I think we've talked about this as a group before, that it's actually nice this year not having to focus on, hey, how do we just balance the budget this year? Instead, are able to look, how do we set ourselves up for success in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Nellie, at one point you had your hand up. Do you still have a question?
Yes, thanks. I actually, it was sort of related to something you touched on a moment ago, especially like, I'm sure this is like a carryover from last year too, but in the diversity, equity, and inclusion section in that office, they state that, it's going to be like a data-driven process. And so not only, my question isn't only for diversity, equity, inclusion, but like across the board. You mentioned, kind of updating the way you collect information or organize information and use it more efficiently. But will you also, are there any areas where you will be additionally collecting information that you haven't had before, so that you can, kind of things that maybe weren't apparent before? Because I remember last year, quite a few times there were questions that were raised, but the data is just not available. And so, I was sort of interested in that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is part of what we're trying to build out with this new system, is the capacity to be able to collect and be able to, a lot of the data that we've asked for in the past exists. It's just not accessible, if that makes sense. It is stuff that is collected, but might be collected, for example, in a single standalone software. And so our transportation is held in this piece of software that does not talk to, for example, our budgeting software, that does not talk to our HR software. And so if I'm asking a question that triangulates any of those data points, I wouldn't be able to see it because they don't talk to each other. And so what we're trying to build out is a system where you can query different pieces of the data and ask those more complex questions to get those complex answers. Because the reality is that our transportation does not live in a vacuum. It is our transportation system works with our HR system, works with our finance system, works with the academic office. This all blends together, and the experience of Arlingtonians is a combination of all of these things. So the questions that we should be asking combine these data points, and up until now, we've been very limited. I will not say that we have been unable to do it entirely, because some of our data systems do in fact talk to each other, but we have been very limited in the amount of data that we've been able to triangulate or crosstab across different data sets. One of the hopes, the work session focused specifically on this, where the Assistant Superintendent of Information Services, Mr. Ajusamili, articulated the plan. I believe it was in October. I am happy to find the link and send the link to everyone so you can take a look at the presentation for that. But it was talking about how these gaps are currently affecting our staff and precluding them from being able to do their jobs well. And so I think that this is it's about $12 million over the course of several years. We are, I believe, in year 2. We're including the costs in year 2 this year. And we have the money for that between our own funding and grant funding that we have secured. And our plan is to invest the $12 million to then see the ROI in the long run. Does that answer your question, Nellie?
Absolutely does. Thanks so much.
Cool.
Okay. Any other questions for Christina before we transition to more of a back-focused discussion?
And again, if anything else comes up, throw it in the chat. I'll answer it there.
Okay, thank you.
Cool.
All right, so what I'd like to transition to now is really, to look ahead to the work we need to do between now and the budget work session, where we'll have an hour to frame our comments and discussion. So as a basis, obviously, I think the budget direction is, really that's the guidance that was provided, and the superintendent obviously reflecting back to the board in the budget his view of what he believes APS needs to do to meet that direction. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up share the presentation from the budget direction, and then what I'd like to do over the next for the next 45 minutes is really talk about how we think the budget meets or doesn't meet, or if there's how we feel about that, the budget versus the budget direction. And then are there any other topic areas that we would want to include in our discussion with the school board that may not be reflected in the budget direction? For example, use of reserves is not a piece of the budget direction, but obviously it's going to be a very essential item of discussion, I think, as an example of where we may want to spend some time with the board talking about reserve use as it relates to matters that are not directly related to the budget direction, but they certainly do in the sense of sustainability and other areas. So permit me a moment to share my screen. I'm a Zoom guy, so Teams is not my strength, but can everyone see this, the budget direction, the first slide here? If someone could just give me a verbal.
Yep. Yes.
Okay. So this is, the overall mission, right? I think, as I look at this, laying the groundwork for success and sustainability in the future is the one important point, but also the high quality education. I think, we're very fortunate in Arlington County to have a very well-resourced and high quality school system. Having moved around the country a bit, I have seen, a number of different school systems, and, this is certainly one reason we chose to plant our roots here in Arlington was because of APS. And I think a lot of members of our community would feel the same way. So, important for us to make sure that we help get this right as a function of what, how we use our resources to deliver the instruction and the quality that, our, all of the citizens of the county expect. So if we look at then the specific pieces of the budget direction, I'm not certainly going to read these for you, but what I'd like to do is, based on what is in front of us on this particular slide, where it talks about, the academic needs, focusing on literacy and math, innovation and equity. What I'd like, just, kind of open forum at this point to hear other members' thoughts on where they see the budget with respect to these points, and, kind of take the discussion from there without, really any agenda at that point. I am not able to see if people have raised their hands because of the way this, things are being shared. So if Eric or someone can guide me if someone has a point to raise. But at this point, I'd like to throw the floor open to the rest of the members of the BAC about how they feel about the points from the budget direction vis-a-vis this budget, and how we think we're doing from this perspective.
Chuck, I don't see any hands up right now. Jen.
Hi. So I guess I would just say that I think that we're under investing in this area. We obviously know why, because we started with compensation and other things, but identifying and reporting, it seems like we're making good progress there, but the addressing is lacking.
And so I guess, Jim, from your viewpoint, if we, we have the resources that we have, but would you focus, I guess, Bridget gave us some wish lists about, the greater staffing needs that they would prefer to put in place now. Is that kind of where your thinking is? Or I guess, how would you see, if you believe there's an underinvestment, what would be an investment that you felt met the direction?
Right. Well, I think at a minimum, any additional dollars we get either from funding sources or things that reduce expenses, sometimes those things happen. Any additional dollars, this should be the top of the list, I guess, to start. Second, I would say we should go back and rethink how the resources we're adding are being deployed. So to the conversation from earlier, we're just looking at populations of schools. We should be going and looking at which schools have the most students with the lowest scores, and we should be allocating it that way. So I think we can allocate the resources smarter instead of just sticking a half a resource or a person in each school building. Let's see where we can get the most benefit. And that's not how the planning factors work, obviously, but I think that would be a good thing to say, is that let's do it a different way. We know that there's needs. Let's put the people where the needs are.
Okay. Do other folks have thoughts along those lines, as Jim pointed out?
Yeah, and I agree with that, especially, talking about the gap that we're just trying to, the hole we're trying to dig ourselves out of from, the last couple of years, and some of the points that Bridget made. I agree that that's an area where we need to be try and find a way to spend more dollars to help students get back to where they should be, let alone getting them back to where we ultimately think they need to be. So that's certainly an area that I think we need to focus on. Again, we're going to have to balance all these things, but for me. That's a big gap area still.
Okay. Other folks with thoughts on the the literacy and math focus piece of the budget direction? Yeah. So Andy, go ahead.
Sorry, thanks. I just wanted to ask about if we are able to support the need at every school for, if there was a measure in FY19 or FY20 for who gets, based on test scores, summer school or other resources needed to meet success. Are we able to do that, or did we change the level of testing based on the resources available, and if there's a way to increase resources available to that same level of students to meet that need? Thanks.
Okay. I mean, I'll be honest, Andy. I don't know. I think we've certainly got a, as we talk about a theme or a narrative for our discussion with the board, I think certainly this is front and center. And not that we have to have consensus. In fact, I don't think I want to drive this discussion toward consensus, because I think consensus leads to compromise. So I think if there are dissenting views,
totally
folks,
agree.
we need to do more, or some folks think we need to do less. I think it's okay to provide that broader range of feedback that, hey, the consensus view is this, but other members have felt maybe we should do this much more, this much less, or however that goes. I think that's okay. But I think as far as like a first theme is this idea of the investment we need to make on learning loss, and the strategies by which this budget is doing that. And do we feel like that is, obviously we're not going to do it all this year, because I don't know that that's feasible. Even if we had all the resources, I don't know that you get the gap resolved in a single academic year. But I guess, I think our first kind of theme or discussion with the board, I think, is around this idea of the investment that this budget's making and how we feel about that. And, in the next couple of weeks, we'll pull in the input that each of you have toward that. Catherine?
Yeah, thanks.
I really am hoping that we can try to differentiate between the learning loss recovery one-time type things, like, okay, people are not going to recover in a year, but maybe, in 2 to 3 years, hopefully, in our dreams, right, we'll be putting some of this, big trouble of the last 2 years behind us. And at the same time, we need to think of a base level that is not going to be such a huge increase. I mean, we have, addressing the compensation and the recovery. These are just two huge issues coming in. And I'm hearing about, use of reserves and the advertised rates and the, cost per student and such are really a big change, a big boost up. So in our discussion, yes, some of it is absolutely vital because of the losses of the recent time period versus setting a new base run rate going forward. I think we should have a community discussion about the run rate at the same time that we're investing in bridging this gap.
So if I could just ask maybe a clarifying question. So what you're talking about, Catherine, is you're kind of, no matter where we are in terms of learning loss, whatever, there's a baseline level of support that we should invest in no matter what the situation is. But then there's also these sort of additional dollars that are focused on specific gaps that are identified. Is that what you're saying, or am I misunderstanding your point?
So I mean, we need to support this, what we call emergency, one time, horrible things that have just happened and are still happening, but if we're thinking that this is like a new run rate for the future, I think that's not sustainable when we look at the expenditure per student and, tax burden and all those things. So okay. Just somewhere we need to keep in mind that just because we're doing something now, we're doing it for a specific reason. And if adding all of these recovery resources doesn't result in recovery in 2 or 3 years, then we've really overlooked something or missed something in our base.
Okay, I understand now. Thank you. Part of this, the ensuring student well-being and academic progress addresses equity. And so I'd be interested in views specifically focused on equity and kind of where different members view this budget with respect to equity as a principle. Yeah, Bridget, go ahead.
Yeah, Chuck, no matter how we allocate the funds that we want to appropriate, I think we should always then look at what the funds are for and how we can then proportionately provide them in a way that provides resources more in favor of the students that have the highest need, whether it's special education, some other disability through 504. Of course, there are the race disparities, income disparities, all of those things. I think those equitable outcomes need to really be addressed no matter what we do. So in every decision that we make, I feel like there should be a matrix, a hierarchy of needs, even if it's for, say, math intervention or reading literacy or whatever it is. I think from that, there should be a tiered system where we then look at, well, who should get it, the Title I, and then after that, then who? I don't know if it should necessarily be population-based. I know Bridget mentioned, schools with 650 or more. It should probably be where the greatest need is, period. Regardless of whether it's Title I or after Title I, then where the need is or where the students are who traditionally get the least. I believe strongly that that's how we address these serious issues of equity. And I've also been thinking a lot about special education and how we have the one speaker who had a very compelling case to why special education should really receive a lot of extra focus. And, that's really weighed heavily on me. So I'm looking at this, I'm looking at the data, I'm looking at general classroom teachers, I'm looking at general education students, then I'm looking at special education. And Eric, I took your comments to heart about teaching assistants and how that can lower the rate of teachers and how, certain teachers can be paid more at different schools and all of that. And it really, to me, re-emphasizes the point that we should really be focusing more on the students that don't necessarily get the attention that they deserve. So that is, I'm saying a lot and probably not saying much, but really whatever we do, it should be with those focuses in mind. And again, I'm new to this, so I don't know how this works. I'm just voicing my opinion as they come to me.
No, this is the best part of the work we do because it's this dialogue that, just people verbalizing what they feel, how they're seeing this, I think leads to different points of discussion that ultimately help us kind of center where we're going to go. If I could maybe try to, I don't want to say restate, but maybe summarize in a different way what you said. There's a natural tension between planning factors, which are common to all, which, for certain things, there has to be, some sort of the common basis by which the schools are resourced for, teachers, assistants, et cetera. But then we have an assessment-based approach where those planning factors, while they're important, if you have parts of the school system that are really struggling for a variety of reasons, there's that tension between what the planning factors dictate common levels of resourcing have to be, and then the need for additional resources above and beyond those planning factors. Is that sort of where,
It does. You summarized it. That is what I think you were trying to say. But in addition to the planning factors, that there could be some kind of K factor that was specifically for, or the equity quotient, or whatever you want to call it, that helped to level the playing field, so to speak, or just provide that or that additional support for those schools or teachers or students, or those areas of focus that aren't quite there yet.
Okay. Other folks, thoughts on the equity component to this, different viewpoints out there? Okay, we'll move on to the next one here, which really talks about the workforce and ensuring that we stay as competitive as possible as a district vis-a-vis our neighboring counties that are also equally interested in having a high quality workforce. So obviously this budget, unlike I think any of us who've been on the BAC a while had seen, makes a significant investment in making up compensation for some of the challenges we've had in the past with compensation increases. So I guess first and foremost with the just how we are, what has been proposed in terms of the compensation increase, how we feel about that, particularly is it competitive, or do we believe it will continue to be competitive in the future? But also at the same time, in an effort to be competitive, is it going to be sustainable? So welcome your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I guess. So this is Eric again. So certainly we're overdue for some compensation adjustments, or we've been putting this off year after year. That's the piece that kind of gets set aside, and we're certainly overdue. But there is that concern about the sustainability part, right? When we know that compensation is 90% of our operating budget, and we start looking at again those out years in the budget. It just says that structurally we have to figure out a way to manage that, right? And I'm not sure that we've figured that part out. We certainly need, again, in the short term, we would need to do something, but in line with that, we need a structural change that will allow us to stay within, make those compensation increases sustainable. And I'm not sure that we're there yet.
And by structural change, you're just referring to the overall level of staffing throughout the system, not specific. Yeah,
I mean, part of that has to be looking at our staffing, our structure, whether we need to look at adjusting. I'm not sure the details yet, but there's a variety of different ways to look at it. Whether you look at it from a pyramid perspective and see how do we figure out how to get more teachers on board who are more younger. And then, an overall scale cost a little less, or I'm not sure what that looks like yet, but we have to figure that part out. Otherwise, I think we put ourselves into a situation that's not sustainable over the long term.
Okay. I guess my concern on the sustainability end is, one component is what our neighboring districts are going to do in terms of compensation increases that they plan or propose, and I think we'll just have to keep an eye on that. Because poor phrase, but I think we could find ourselves in a bit of an arms race with neighboring counties with respect to compensation, and at some point we run out of room on the budget from a revenue perspective, and so we know generally that's either going to lead to higher assessments or higher tax rates will be required at some point if the expenditure side continues to grow without obviously the revenue component has to match that. And so, you know, how we as voters also will feel about that in the future is certainly going to be a piece of the puzzle. But on the sustainability piece, and I know we're not going to solve it for this year, but I feel compelled that we have to make the point that, you know, we live in a very high cost of living county, and, you know, how we look at cost of living adjustments. I know, you know, we're not going to solve that this year, but I feel compelled that we have to say something about how do we look at compensation in the future with respect to some means of adjusting the salary scales for, you know, inflation and other cost of living factors that, you know, that just by virtue of where we live are, you know, are different than other parts of the country. And so we have to, you know, be mindful of that. And I don't know how, you know, I don't view yet that we've really sorted out how we're going to be able to do that in a sustainable way. It's just an immense challenge that, you know, we don't have taxing authority, so we just can't set taxes however we want. We're subject to what others have to, you know, what others have to do. So I think that's going to be a challenge. You know, we're not like the federal government can just say, okay, we're going to have a, you know, 2.5% increase, and, you know, we borrow and do other things to get there. We don't have that same luxury. Michael?
Thanks, Chuck. And there's a few points here I want to make. And
yeah, go ahead.
First, I'll just go off what you said and what Josh put into the comments, which is that AEA has been asking for an index tied to compensation, especially in regards to cost of living adjustments over time. And I think what you were trying to get at, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's kind of tough for Arlington School Board to make those kind of ties when, again, if it comes to a point in the future where that's locked in and that has to be done. And it's great security for our teachers, and I understand why they would want that and need that, and can't really blame them for that. But if we tie it to something like that, that means there's no adjustments moving forward when it might be a crunch time, since we don't have control of what our revenue looks like, where we have to make choices between honoring that tied compensation index or making cuts elsewhere to our educational learning requirements for our students. And I think that's where it gets difficult to just think that that's the easy solution. It's a good one. It's one we should talk about, but it's not necessarily, again, I think the one we can just automatically say is the right one. And I think that's where I think you were coming from, Chuck. And I think that's where a lot of people are talking about the sustainability. I don't think there's an easy solution to that. And so I think we need to talk it out. And again, that's not to say that AEA is not right in proposing that. It's just that's something that we need to look further into moving forward. But I think when it comes to the compensation and everything, there's a few different things here. And again, it's not that we're unsupportive of teachers or the staff and their desires and everything. And they definitely are owed a lot for all the things that they do for our students on a daily basis. But I do think this is the forum to talk about these types of topics and kind of like discuss what the changes that need to be made, especially moving forward. And one of the things I've kept bringing up over and over again is just like, to your point about the arms race, Chuck, is like, what is this arms race? Where are we capturing by increasing our compensation to a certain level to match it? But I want our schools to be competitive. I want our schools to be the best. Like you, that's one reason why we are living in Arlington. We have 4 kids. We hope to have the best teachers teaching them, and I'm sure that competition drives a lot of them to come to this area. But like, are we losing lots of teachers because of the compensation? Are we not? Are we turning good teachers away? I think in a couple of past meetings, we haven't really had hard numbers about how many teachers are leaving, how many teachers are coming in. We know that there's a lack of talent, but that's across the board in the entire country. There's people leaving because of very different reasons, whether it's pandemic related, retirement, or pay. We don't have that information to make some of these decisions. It's been really difficult to say, is pay going to solve all that? Of course, in a large way it will, and I'm guessing in many cases is helpful, but we also need to see where we are at the margins, especially when we're talking about this budget. How many people are we losing how many people are we not losing based off of this increase X? Or how many people are we still keeping if we go back and make these payments back in previous salaries? How many people are not going to leave because we did that? How many new teachers are we attracting because we did this payback system in regards to prior steps that were missed, that we'll gain, that we want to bring into the system that are high quality teachers? Again, those numbers are of course hard to measure and hard to get a hold of, but again, I think it's hard. We're shooting in the dark otherwise if we're thinking about it just largely. We want to match what Fairfax is doing. Well, we're not Fairfax. We're not as large in regards to land and development and tax capabilities that they have. So maybe that's the wrong measurement we should be using. We should be really kind of measuring what we're looking at in regards to our talent and where it's coming from, where it's going, and what their responses are. And I think Josh replied back. And so I'm sure there's some people who know this stuff better. I'm not saying I'm not supportive of what's in this budget right now. What I'm saying is that I think some of our concerns are probably directed around these types of questions where we just don't have enough information to make the right decisions now or moving forward. And I think that's where we really kind of need to drill down a little bit more. And I think I'll end it there and let you all kind of respond to anything I said or correct me if I'm wrong. Thanks.
Yeah, Leslie, I know in the past we've it's kind of been we talk about like exit surveys for staff that do leave. It's a bit hit or miss, if I recall. Some of the, some people do, some people don't. Is there any sense, I guess, compensation versus staffing turnover, kind of where you see it from your view? Or is there someone else within APS that might be better suited to answer that, like out of HR perhaps, that might be better suited to answer that question for us?
Yeah, I don't have any information on that at all, Chuck. I'm sorry. It's possible that HR has some of that information. I know that they've been trying to diligently do exit interviews with those who are actually willing to do an exit interview, obviously, because you can't force somebody to do that. But we can certainly see if there's any data available. I'll ask. No problem asking.
Yeah, no, that would be helpful. I know, it may or may not inform, but I know, at least if there is something, it would help us. Other folks' thoughts on what Michael said. I think, I think over time we've wrestled with this tension of, how we're compensating our staff, not just teachers, but across all the different scales. Being able to account for things such as cost of living, being competitive in this tension that exists, given that, again, we are subject to an economic environment that we can't predict year to year what it's going to look like, but also, the revenue formula that we have with the county. I know in the past we've taken, some steps to look at, going back to the revenue sharing formula with the county. But again, that's not something we necessarily count on. But I guess, do other folks have thoughts on this tension on compensation that haven't been addressed or that they'd like to voice? Okay. The next piece, the budget direction talks about, the operational efficiency. I know we've heard a couple of things, such as the upgrade in our HR system that, really should drive some degree of efficiencies. Melanie, I know you brought up some points as well. But thoughts or views here on the budget with respect to efficiency and how we see that reflected in the budget. I know there, Christina had some points about stuff that didn't make the budget, but I guess based on what has been presented, how do folks see this particular area? Okay. And then before we kind of get to the other pieces, our reserve usage obviously this year is really high. Both for use in one time, but also some degree of recurring costs. And so as we look at reserve usage, obviously this year we had a pretty large closeout that has been higher than than previous years. Viewpoints on reserve usage. Should we do more, less? How does the BAC feel, your members feel about how we're deploying our reserves, and are we over relying upon them? Whatever.
Well, again, I think that the reserves are there to be used in the right way. I mean, obviously, but the question, it's a matter of just sustainability, right? I mean, I think that's where we get, it's the point we've already made, I think.
Other thoughts? Okay, overall, any other views or comments about the budget that haven't been addressed already tonight? Okay, all right, then I'm going to go ahead and close the discussion for that. I'd like to talk about in the next few minutes, running up to 9 o'clock, is we have the, let me just refresh the schedule here, so let me stop sharing for a moment. So if we look ahead, we have on April 5th is our 1 hour session we have with the school board to provide our input. So I do think we need to meet on March 30th, even if it's just for an hour, to go over the final presentation that I'll build with everyone's input. But I think, the 30th, if we just plan for 7 to 8 o'clock in the evening, really to go over a final draft of the presentation, and then make any changes we need to make there, and then snap the chalk line and give it to the school board so that they have time to absorb it as well, and consider our input ahead of time, so we can have a more discussion-driven hour than a presentation-driven hour. What I'd like to do for that hour is confine the presentation to no more than 20 minutes. And so my view, there's probably about 5 to 6 topic slides at most in 20 minutes that I think, to go over and address, and then really to spend the other 2/3 of the time a discussion among the different board members and the BAC is kind of how I'm looking at putting this together. So what I'm going to do over the next couple of days is just build a storyboard of the presentation based on your comments and feedback tonight, really framed around the budget direction as the framework to build the presentation. And then, what I'll ask when I send that out, probably look for feedback mid next week at the latest from BAC members on points that points and feedback you wish to raise. That has to be point to point. We can't do it in sort of a group email kind of format, because that violates the public hearing rules that we're bound by. So it has to be point to point. So as you get this packet from me to consider, just that direct feedback to me, I'll compile, collate together, and then we'll spend an hour on the 30th as a group just going over the presentation, the points, making any changes that we need to make. And then what we'll do is when we have what our time slot is going to be on the 5th, and I believe right now it's 6:30 to 7:30. I'll confirm that with Dr. Cannon. We would, again, about 20 minutes of presentation, and then, really like to get to 40 minutes of just good dialogue and discussion among all us and the members of the school board. So that's kind of how I'm going to start focusing, putting this together. Any thoughts or questions about that approach?
Yeah, it makes
Sounds
sense. Is there anything we can do to help in the interim, Chuck? I mean, is there things that we can help you to do?
That's a good question.
Yeah, so I guess like for right now, like if you have any immediate feedback you want to throw my way, please do so. I'm gonna, I think by Friday at the latest, I'll have sort of a skeleton of a, you know, like, okay, this is how I'm, in my mind, I'm seeing the presentation go. Send that out on Friday, you know, if, you know, over the weekend, if folks have ideas about what to, you know, just things that we want to present, you know, take the weekend to do that. But I'll lay out a timeline that, so that we get the appropriate level of feedback, you know, in a time where we can all consider what's being put together and presented. So I think, you know, what a goal would be to have a draft by mid next week after all of the input from the committee, send that back out, you know, get another iteration, and then, you know, something we'd, you know, be able to sit down as a group on the 30th and go over. The other intervention point here is just input from other advisory committees. I've asked them, we're going to do a meeting on the 29th with Dr. Cannon and the different advisory chairs. So there may be some last, you know, kind of laster minute stuff that comes in from them that is certainly worthy of input, particularly like, you know, special education, some of the other stuff, teaching and learning that we've talked about. There may be some specific things that might come out of that discussion that I'll roll into our presentation, and then we could talk about it on the 30th. Timeline is not ideal for that, but different committees have different meeting cadences, so I can't really fight City Hall on that front. Other questions or comments not related to tonight's discussion. I know some folks haven't really provided much input, but you know, certainly if you feel more comfortable, you know, just blasting an email and pouring your heart out into an email, and that's fine too. It really doesn't matter how we get it as long as we get it. And I'll be one final point. While consensus is great, sometimes consensus also leads to a watering down of conclusion. So I'm perfectly comfortable in areas where we may have disagreement among us, letting the board know that. You know, I think certainly there's some areas where we're probably all going to feel pretty strongly in a particular direction, but if there's areas of dissent, I think it's okay to not grind ourselves into middle ground and saying, well, you know, we had to water it down to this to get there. If you know, we have a consensus view, or, you know, the preponderance of the group has a particular view, but there's some dissenting opinions, and I think it's certainly okay to highlight both. We don't have to all agree on how this works. I think ensuring that all the views are adequately and faithfully presented is where, you know, just as a guiding principle, I want to make sure we get to.
Chuck,
yeah, go ahead.
Will we be able to see the other viewpoints so that we have a diversity of opinion? And then, because there may be some points that we haven't heard that are expressed to you that are important, that can help inform our decisions as well.
Yeah, so as I get this first round of input and comment, I'll collate that together as best as I possibly can, and then I'll put that back out to everyone so you can see. You know, it won't be for attribution. I don't want to do it that way, but you know, certainly you can see the different points that are raised that other folks may have that may differ from what you may feel about a particular topic.
Okay, thank you.
That work?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Any other questions or comments for tonight before we wrap up and adjourn? Okay, so what I owe the team here is just to lay out the timeline between now and the 30th, and points of time where I need particular things from the group. Obviously, if you have opinions now about the budget, sooner is better. That will help me be a bit more thoughtful how we organize and package this so that our discussion with the work session on the 5th is as fruitful as we can. And then, we'll take it from there. So that's what I owe. I think we'll be waiting for Bridget. Loft had something she was going to fire back to us on the grant in terms of if we had been fully resourced based on the 15 million, what that would have resulted in staffing. I think that's an important question for us to consider. You should have seen the first round of budget questions that came out on Friday. I sent that out to just the BAC members. So please take a look at those. And as I get those from Leslie, I'll make sure that those come out to the group. And then certainly if you haven't had an opportunity, there's a couple of work sessions that have already been done that are recorded and online. Please go ahead and as your time and schedule allow to take a look at those work sessions and see the different discussions that do go on that help end up building the budget. All right, with that, do I have a motion to adjourn?
I move to adjourn, Chuck.
And do we have a second?
Second.
I second.
Anyone opposed? Raise your hand. All right. Thanks everyone for your time and talent tonight. And expect by afternoon tomorrow a timeline over the next couple of weeks how we're going to get ourselves in a place to have a thoughtful discussion with the school board. Thank you.
Thanks, Chuck.
Thank you, everybody.